going to take a look at kind of exercise and cold environments. So, what happens with exercise when you start getting a lot more heat loss? When is it helpful? When is it a detriment? All right. So, generally, as we've been saying quite a bit, heat loss in water is definitely worse. Especially moving water is going to lead to a decrease in core temp, and generally we cannot produce enough heat from exercise, then we lose from convection and through conduction to that water. Normally in air environments you can sustain your core temp exercising in temperatures like it says there down to like 20 below zero in terms of air temperatures. Water, it's going to be much more difficult to do that. So there's going to be definitely a number of factors that are going to influence how much heat we lose during exercise to the environment, as in water as well as air. One of the things, as we're doing more exercise, you are going to be moving more heat from the trunk and the core out to the extremities, which is going to increase that surface area for you to have heat transfer. As you're being more active there, which is going to give you a tendency over time, especially in very cold water, to lose more heat to that environment. Again, just increasing that overall surface area where you're putting blood to. Normally, when you're doing exercise, you are going to be generating a little more heat in these extremities, but again, it's that balancing act. Are you generating more heat in this environment than you are losing due to that increased movement? Because again, you're going to get rid of that insulatory water if you're talking about in water, or that layer that's surrounding you there, which is going to increase that convective heat loss. The other thing is, especially in the extremities relative to the trunk, subcutaneous body fat will be one of those that will help. If you have more of this in the extremities, this is going to insulate you better from cold environments and have decreased heat loss. So generally, increased body fat is going to decrease heat loss kind of across the board. The other thing that makes a difference is a little bit in terms of what you're exercising. If you're moving mainly just your arms due to the mass size of the arms as well as the blood flow to that, arm exercise is generally going to lead to a greater loss of heat than leg exercise. It's just smaller mass and generally less adipose tissue. Also, generally, because these muscles aren't as big, does not generate as much heat. So we know generally in the arms less subcutaneous fat than there are in the legs. As well as leg exercises, it's a larger muscle, it's going to generate more heat. It also tends to be closer to that trunk or core, so it's going to help out a little bit more. Like I said, performing the same absolute workload. The workload in the arms tends to be a higher percentage of the VO2 max, so you tend to have more blood flow to the arms to generate the same amount of heat as you would in the legs. Which again, if we're talking about having to send it out into a cold environment, it's going to be more heat loss if you're doing mainly an arm exercise. And this kind of shows it right here. If you're moving just your legs, this is showing you at different water temperatures and how much of core temp drop there is. So, but you can see it through all these temperatures. If you're moving just your legs, you tend to have a better core temperature, as you can see over here. Relative, if you're doing arms, you can see that you tend to have a drop once you start getting in kind of cold water. And even if you're using your legs and your arms, you tend to lose more water, lose more temperature to the water through the arms than you're gaining by bringing the legs in. And it's again, just doing that leg movement is going to be a lot better for maintaining that core temperature, especially as you get into these colder water environments. So if we start looking at exercise in cold air, this is a little bit different than water. Again, that thermal conductivity is not nearly as great in the air. So generally, exercise in cold air, you can usually generate enough heat to maintain heat balance. And again, we can then move that blood flow around to the extremities to generally make sure that there is no damage or maintain that temperature throughout the body. One of the things we will see is you can lose a lot of heat through ventilation. The fact that you're working out more and inhaling colder air in, it is going to have an effect on core temp. Can drop at about 9%, can lead to changes there, like it says about 10%. Main thing is though we are heating this up quite a bit, so it does not have a major effect on core temp. And again, we're going to take a look again at the body fat in cold air. Just like with the water, but probably even more so with the air, increased body fat is going to protect against heat loss. So increased subcutaneous fat, particularly in the extremities, as well as the trunk and abdomen, is going to help maintain core temp. And like it says there, core temperature during cold air exposure tends to be related linearly to body fat. So generally, the more subcutaneous fat you have, the more insulating you can do, and the lesser drop you're going to see in these cold air environments. And it does this again because fat is not a good conductor of heat. It is not going to let you move a lot of that heat from the core to the shell when we're in these cold air environments. The other thing is we will see vasoconstriction, and again, let's letting the shell get colder while maintaining that heat to the core, and again, that fat is going to help insulate that and hold that in. So overall, what does this do when you're actually talking about trying to be active in the cold? What effects does this have on performance? So we can look at the respiratory system, cardiorespiratory system, muscular endurance. How does it affect strength or power? So cardiorespiratory wise, it is going to have an effect on your VO2 max and overall your maximal exercise performance. We tend to see a decrease in the maximal heart rate and therefore an overall decrease in cardiac output in the cold. The other issue that we have is the core is going to get a little bit colder. That does left shift that hemoglobin dissociation curve, which means unloading of oxygen or the O2 extraction is going to be much more difficult as we get into colder environments, which, again, because this is a combination of the cardiac output and extraction of oxygen from the blood, if we're reducing the extraction of oxygen and more of it staying in the blood, so we're not seeing as big of arteriovenous difference, it means we are going to have a drop in our VO2 max. And again, this is just showing that idea right here is the normal temperature. If we get a decreasing temp, we are going to shift it to the left. Oops, I went the wrong way. We're going to get a left shift here. So at any particular level of O2, you're going to see it is going to be more saturated when, again, that is meaning this is going to be holding on to much more oxygen at the tissues. Less likely to be able to give that away. So overall, your maximum here, it really depends on how cold we're talking about. A little bit of cooling is going to, it really depends on how cold, like I said. So if there is, it could be no change, it could be a decrease or an increase. Generally, if we are seeing falls in core temp, it is going to decrease your VO2 max. If we are not having this at a level where there is a drop in that core temp, we might have a little bit better VO2 max because we're not having to really worry about doing much in the way of cooling of the body. It's being taken care of environmentally. As we're generating this heat, we are dissipating it without having to shunt blood to the skin or other areas. If we are getting a fall in core temp, this is going to lower VO2 max. We do see decreases in plasma volume, which is going to decrease oxygen transport to the muscle tissues. Again, generating more urine. We are going to be sweating a little bit here. Both ways we lose some of this plasma volume. And again, even in the cold environments, you do need to be drinking to replace these things. You are still going to sweat. You're still going to generate urine. And you can kind of see drops in plasma volume in cold versus normal environments, pre-acclimation, post-acclimation. You really don't see a difference in terms of the fact that we're going to see a drop in plasma volume. We will see, generally, if we're dropping that core, we're going to see an earlier onset of fatigue, which means at any submaximal level, it's going to be a little bit harder to do that particular activity. Again, if we are having core temperature drops, we are going to be upping our metabolic rate, which is going to be requiring more oxygen to do that, which oxygen to increase that metabolic rate is not oxygen we can give to the tissues. The other thing this is going to do is if we are doing a higher level of metabolism, it means we need a fuel source to deal with that. What that means is the body's going to be tapping into glycogen. It's going to be generating lactate. All these things, again, just to elevate this metabolic rate means we have less glycogen for activity. We are working with lactate levels that are going to be higher. So if we are generating any of those by activity, it means we're going to be generating these much sooner at lower intensities. And again, both these things are going to really cause a drop in that VO2 max because again, we are tapping into these energy sources sooner. The other thing is as we get colder, we do start trying to physiologically shunt this, as well as that norepinephrine release that we see in the cold environments is going to cause vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction is going to limit oxygen delivery. If we limit oxygen delivery, it means that we have to rely on anaerobic production mechanisms and lactate build up much lower levels of intensity, which again is going to decrease performance. And again, if we're not dropping off the oxygen from the hemoglobin because we've left shifted that, that is also going to mean less oxygen being delivered to the muscles, and that is going to be a drop in performance. So you can see generally the cold, at least in terms of cardiorespiratory endurance, is not helpful. Definitely causing more issues than it's helping out with here. So overall, endurance-wise, we are going to see a decrease in endurance. So maximally, we're doing a higher percentage of our VO2 max at any sub-maximal level. Again, because we are having to increase metabolic rates, we are seeing increased decreased lipid use, more use of carbohydrates. We're going to get increased lactate buildup. We're not going to be able to unload our oxygen to the muscles as easily, as well as we are also starting to shunt blood to that core, which means we are going to have a more difficult time delivering oxygen to those muscles, all of which is going to decrease your ability to maintain endurance. And again, this is showing, even here in time to exhaustion, you can see at hot environments, we know that we definitely have issues with maintaining endurance. At these more thermoneutral levels, we can go a lot longer, but you can see even in the cold, we have a similar effect as 10 degrees above kind of thermoneutral, 10 degrees below. We can see they're at similar levels. So as you start going colder, there does again start to be a bigger metabolic cost, and therefore our time to exhaustion, our ability to do performance in these cold environments is going to be decreased. And this again is showing that VO2 max, VO2 oxygen consumption, and one of the things you'll notice here at these cold environments, our oxygen consumption is up quite a bit. And again, this is to support those higher metabolic rates, and if you are doing any shivering, to support the cost of that. So oxygen consumption definitely at cold environments is going to be much higher. It is a much more caloric intense type of activity. You are going to burn to do activities in the cold much higher levels of calories to maintain that, again meaning that fuel sources and other stuff like that, it requires more oxygen, and again also means that nutritionally to do anything long term in the cold, you definitely need to be supporting that. When we start looking at strength and power, it's going to depend a little bit on how cold we're talking. At particularly cold and things here, especially any of these reactions are going to be slowed down in the cold. So if we're doing even very quick anaerobic things here, the warmer muscle is more helpful. Having a colder muscle is not going to help with muscle strength and performance. So generally, we are going to see reduced strength, decreased peak velocity in terms of how fast you can move, and definitely in any of these power events, sprint events, burst events, like jumping events, they're going to definitely have decreased performance. Mainly, again, this slows down a lot of these chemical reactions, so it takes longer for those muscles to reach tension. The ability of how fast they can reset those cross bridges is slowed down. Everything is moving a little bit slower because there's increased viscosity in that sarcoplasm. So calcium is going to be moving slower, all that muscle contraction stuff where we need diffusion to happen. We know lower temperatures leads to slower diffusion. And again, chemical reactions in general are slowed down. All these things are going to mean things are going to take a little bit longer to happen when you start getting in these cold environments. And like it says here, muscular endurance on these ones, it's reduced nerve conduction. Less recruitment is going to mean that this muscle is not going to be able to generate as much power. Again, if we summarize this, a little bit cooler is actually probably helpful. It means less to fatigue. But once we get these muscles at all much colder, you're going to fatigue much faster and you're going to have a decrease in maximum power and strength. The other thing that we start getting into with the cold is a lot of times nerve impulse conduction and the ability to have fine motor control is lost in the cold. So anything that is needing dexterity or these smaller movements is a lot of times also going to be greatly affected by the cold. If you've ever been out in the cold environment, you get back in and you really can't control your hands well. You can kind of see that idea. And overall, if you look at muscle tension, fiber recruitment is reduced through all fiber types in the cold. So bottom line, a little bit of cold can be good for performance, but once you start getting very cold, VO2 max is going to go down. Submaximal performance is reduced, fatigue is going to be more rapid, and your strength and power are also going to be decreased. So little cold, good. Once you get past that, performance is going to decrease kind of across the board, both endurance-wise as well as strength and power-wise. And the main thing we have to worry about is kind of these overall temperatures. So again, you can kind of see cold air, we know we can generally maintain thermoneutral, but as wind speeds go up, that increases that convective heat loss. So you can kind of see once you start getting air temperatures of 30 degrees even, if you start getting a 30 mile per hour wind, it is going to feel like it's much colder. We started bringing that risk in, and temperatures that are even 10 degrees with a 20 mile an hour wind start feeling much colder. You're going to start having these very dangerous levels of cold in terms of convective heat loss with the body, and we can start leading to really cold injuries. And that's one of the things you have to watch out for. I mean, and there's been times I know for a fact a couple of years ago was running with people over in Lake Placid, and it was negative 10 degrees air temperature, and we had a slight wind, and those wind chills we were running in about negative 35, and that is where you have everything except for about right here covered in order to do that, and it is definitely a lot harder. Again, where we have an issue here is the cold. If you get too cold, you're going to have freezing of tissues, you get ice crystals, that leads to frostbite. But the other issue we have as well is to maintain core temperature, you're going to have local vasoconstriction, as well as increased blood viscosity. What this is going to mean is reduced blood flow to these particular areas. That can lead to acidosis in those local ones there, which can lead to frostbite again, or capillary wall damage, which again can lead to reduced blood flow, and you can kind of see how this can feed back on itself. But again, the cold can lead to damage to these tissues. What we really want to avoid is loss of blood flow to these areas and freezing of the skin. Again, low air temperatures, high wind chill on exposed skin can lead to frostbite. And again, we don't want that to be what's going to happen. But this is kind of going through some of those causes of frostbite. But again, frostbite is a lot like some of these burn type of categories here. So you can see a little bit of frostbite is going to mean redness, swelling, no tissue loss though. But if you start getting really bad frostbite, you are going to get blistering, much like a second-degree burn. Sometimes the skin will be turned black. Third degree, you get really black skin, black masses on these ones here. You sometimes see this. People that have mountain climbed will have black fingers. If you start getting these really bad ones here, it can mean complete damage to the skin, full freezing, like it says, a mummification of this tissue, which may lead to the need for amputation on this. So, and it's kind of showing you different water temperatures. what is kind of considered safe and when you're going to be having issues with survival time in terms of hours. And you can see as you start getting really cold water, survival times start going very, very low in terms of those Celsius temperatures. And again, just showing you some of the signs and symptoms of hypothermia. Really, once we start getting that body core temp down to about 95 degrees Fahrenheit or about 35 degrees Celsius, we are going to have that maximal shivering. This is going to bring in a lot of different issues. But again, you get cold enough, it is going to lead to stopping of the heart, and that obviously is going to